Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is historian Elena Kochetkova. Her presentation today comes from her new book, The Green Power of Socialism, Wood, Forest, and the Making of Soviet Industrially Embedded Ecology, just published by MIT Press. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest.
Thanks a lot to James and the Society for having me here. It's really great pleasure to be part of the series. So, yeah, I hope you can hear my first slide now. Yeah, and I'm really happy to talk about my research, which is actually completed, and this is a book. Yeah, it was published just a few months ago. Just a fact from my professional biography is that I'm a historian, and I used to see myself as an interdisciplinary historian, so someone who works at the crossroads of environmental, technological, economic history, and history of state socialism, and particular Russian history. So it's very interdisciplinary history, I would say. But the book that I published with MIT Press last February is designed for a bigger audience. So actually, this discusses not very scholarly, I would say, topics, but more broader issues related to the way how people exploited their forests and their natural resources in the past, in particular in state socialism and authoritarian regimes. So the focus of this book is forests, industry, and the Soviet regime and post-socialist Russia. So in this presentation, I will keep things quite broad. So I will address to my book. So here it is, actually. So this is again this cover of my book. And good news is that it's open access. So if you want to just look at it or get inside, you're welcome to get to the MIT Press website and see it's open access. And of course, it's available for purchase. Yeah, but the idea of the book was to challenge what we knew, what we have learned about state socialism and its approach to nature via the lens of industry. So the main idea of the book is to examine the way how the industry exploited its huge natural resources, in particular forests. And this book explains the way how state socialism imagined, exploited, explored, and actually tried to save its own forests for industrial purposes. I'll come up with my main thesis later, approaching to the end of this presentation. But at the beginning of my talk, I would like to share the reasons why I decided to do this research and actually why I wrote this book, and I think why it was published finally. I've been studying forests for quite many years. So I began this journey when I was a PhD student. That was almost 10 years ago, so pretty long ago. And then I was writing a story about the way how the Soviet Union was committed to technology transfer, because the USSR in Russia are well known for transferring technologies, in particular Western technologies, which is a little bit problematic today because of all this things related to sanctions and anti-sanctions and all these economic constraints. But it's still quite strong commitment to transferring foreign technologies for own modernization and industrialization. And that was part and parcel of the Soviet history. And I did research in the way how the Soviets transferred foreign technologies, in particular Finnish technologies, to own forestry industry. So how they tried to modernize this huge and quite outdated industry across the 1950s and 1960s. But then I just got interested in the way how the Soviet Union stored its forests, because its country covered with huge green resources. So, and it's well known that Russia is a country that possesses a lot of forests, and usually it's also built in national narratives, national identity, and forests is very important in Russian history in general, back to its earlier periods, and still very much important today. So it's praised as a rich resource and something that Russia is happy about. But at the same time, we have narratives about the way how the Soviets and how the regime in the Soviet Union and Russia in particular saw its forests and how they dealt with own forests as a very binary perspective. So my point was that we're probably still very much within Cold War binaries about binary visions about state socialism, and it's dealt with nature. And here in the slide, you can see some titles. These are very typical title on the left. This is a book, quite famous and quite old books by Fairbach and Friendly, which is titled Ecocide in the USSR. And ecocide was the term to describe to Soviet and Russian approach to nature. Those who wrote about forests, they also emphasized the fact that the Soviets cut their forests just really radically, so to say, very aggressively. And this view was very much popular in the 1990s, but it's still alive. And there are some historians who argue that the Soviet type of dealing with own forests was just very aggressive exploitation. And they left deserts after their activities, so they just, clear cut their forests. They devastated everything. They contaminated nature, and that was everything we know about the Soviet Union and state socialist regimes. This had been challenged by some historians, for example, Douglas Wiener, in his book A Little Corner of Freedom, who emphasized environmental activism. And there were also some other books, like one by Stephen Brain, who discusses the way how reforestation happened under Stalinism, so under the totalitarian regime. So we challenged this ecocide view a little bit. We have some other narratives. So here you can see a book by Amy Bruno, and who says that it was more holistic approach to nature. It was not just about this total devastation. But in general, we see that it's a controversial thing, controversial past of Russia and the Soviet Union, because on the one hand, we see this well-visible narratives about the rich natural resources, green covers, and this what is usually called port of nature. And at the same time, we see that it was quite intensive for exploitation of forests, and that was intensive industrial building. So I was really interested in the way how the Soviets dealt with own forests, because it seemed to me that the story was much complicated than just these two strands, two different narratives, just this devastating nature and more environmentalist approach, where we see some freedoms, some types of freedom which was embedded in activism and environmental movement. So my book and my research in general discusses how this forests were seen in the Soviet Union and in post-Soviet Russia, and what actually the industry, how the industry dealt with this forest, so how they were exploited. And I began my story, my journey into this topic with their language, Soviet language about the forests. So because it's the most visible thing, and if you open any, Soviet newspaper, any ideological book, you will see that it's always praises the rich or forest richesse of state socialism, usually saying that it was something belonging to the society, belonging to the Soviet Union. It's something rich. It was often called the pot of nature. It was often called green gold or green forest power. That was the phrase that is inspired actually the title of my book. And especially Siberian or eastern part of Russia was seen as national heritage because it was covered with enormous amounts of forest. And usually taiga, which is part of this eastern territory of Russia, was seen as a national pride because there was this green covers there. And again, this somehow contradicted to what we see in other Soviet sources, because when we get industry, into economic narratives about forests, we see that it had quite an important economic implication, and that was very important industrially. So from the very beginning, actually, it dates back to earlier times, of course, but especially in state socialism, in the building of the planned economy, wood as one of the products of forest was very much important. So here you see two pictures. On the left, it's a Soviet one from 1975. So this is from a book which explained what chemistry could manufacture from wood. And that's the idea of this tree that you see on the left is to show how many goods products could be manufactured from wood. The one on the right, it's an earlier one. It's from 1945. Actually, it's from their time. It's a Finnish picture, and it's from the time of the Soviet-Finnish War, and that was made in 1941. But this was wartime in Finland, and the message of this tree was to show again that wood was applicable for many industries, and that different industries would use wood and its different substances. So you see that wood was a source of many products, ranging from gunpowder, so it had a military application, to consumer spheres, so the industry could produce cloth, of course, construction materials as more primitive type. It could produce many other packages, which was very much important in the growing consumer societies. Wood was also, of course, very much important for making different types of paper and so on and so forth. That was something explained by people who work in the forest industry, in particular, by the lens of the relevance of forest as a source of as a finite source of all this richesse, of all this prosperity. So we came up with the ideas expressed by many engineers, industrial scientists, or people whom were called specialists. And actually, my research deals with them using this language. I think I need to show this. I don't know how to put this. Okay. Yeah, so the periods from 1950s, 1960s in Soviet Russia in particular praised wood as a kind of magic material because it was their economic growth in the Soviet Union. That was to a large extent, that was a result of the post-Second World War period. And many people in the industry, or specialists, if we use the Soviet language, they said that, okay, so we got some new materials, we got chemistry, we got something synthetic materials, we got oil and other resources which could be called modern. But look, forest provides modern material as well, because the technological set we've got after the Second World War made it possible to translate wood from this raw material to something industrial. So they justified the use of wood, and these are two examples of this relevance. And also there is one quote in Russian, just to quote an original source. So it actually says that wood remains the material which is very critical for every industry of for every aspect of culture and everyday life. And that was very much important for the period of Nikita Khrushchev, who ruled the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s, because he made a big emphasis on the social prosperity of the prosperity of the society, and the idea was to improve living standards of Soviet citizens. And piece of the story was the construction of apartments, and actually specialists who work in the industry, they said, okay, so we can use wood for actually everything to equip your apartment, right? So it could be used for furniture, and we can manufacture new types of furniture. We can make literally everything. And they also said that wood plastic was very modern material, so something that the society to consumerism could literally consume. And one Soviet book provided a picture, which I love most from all my pictures, and I also put it in my book. So this is a girl, smiling, and she's holding a doll, and actually this is a doll made from wood plastic. So and the picture titled "The First Meeting with Celluloid." So celluloid. This is this translated wood, this magical implication of wood. So you see that it mattered a lot, and that wasn't built. Actually, the relevance of wood wasn't built in post-Second World War narratives that were unfolding in the Soviet Union, and which justified that the Soviet industry had to use wood as much as possible, because it was, again, very modern material, and it could satisfy the economic demand, the consumer society, and many other, complete many other tasks. But there was a problem with that, and that brought me to the key question of my book. So was it actually, what was between this? Yeah, because on the one hand, this was about a story about richer riches, and on the other hand, that was a story about intense economic exploitation of forests to get wood and to make wood into different stories. And I became very much interested in the way how the Soviet regime exploited the forest, because there was another type of sources which emphasized the problem with these two perspectives, with these two narratives about Soviet forests, because these were sources, and these were specialists who stressed that the Soviet forestry industry and the type the Soviet Union exploited its resources was literally backward. And the quotes you see on my screen from 1990, it's a late one, but it repeats the whole narrative that existed before and actually after. It says the largest amount of sawmill materials is consumed in Canada, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and we as a forest power have to reach the same level. I think that this quote, taken from one professional publication, emphasizes this gap between the enrichment for Soviet forests, and at the same time, it stresses that the Soviet Union was a forest power, it was an imperial view of forest, and at the same time, it says that it lagged behind Canada, Sweden, Norway, and other countries, even in terms of exploiting forest in quite a primitive way. It says about sawmill materials. But in general, the Soviet narrative, so that was one, yes. The Soviet narrative about the forest was even more complicated when we read what people in the forestry discussed behind official publications. Because these views and these perspectives I just described, they were mainly shared in the public sphere. These were specialists who published in professional newspapers, in popular newspapers, and journals. But when it got into their professional discussions, what they discussed at research institutes, at industrial enterprises, they actually emphasized that it was a big problem in their type, how the Soviets possessed and exploited their resources, because these rich resources actually were not rich, and they were rather poor from the industrial perspective. So the idea was to emphasize that there were some problems with the way how the forest covered the country and how accessible they were. So one point of criticism was that specialists emphasized how uneven industrial geography of forest was. So here you can see some statistics. I won't be repeating it, but the main point here is that the country, in terms of its forest exploitation, was literally split into two parts, and that was eastern parts, European parts here, which were mainly industrialized, and they were mainly most exploited compared to the eastern part, because this part, in Siberia, and especially in the Far East, this was much less populated. It was historically less exploited. So you see that the number of buildings, actually this dots mean different types of building of industrial enterprises. It was much less industrialized, and also the Soviet Union was a country which possessed the South republics, so which were not forested, and they were quite densely populated in the south of Russia, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, and these territories also needed some products made from wood, actually, but they were not well covered by forests, and that was one problem they emphasized. Others said that another problem was the transportation, and again, a big problem was that industrial enterprises were located quite far away from the places where wood was harvested, and that's implied quite a big cost of transportation. Other specialists also said about Western practices of forest activities, of forest industry, and they said that forest was actually not a forest, but it was a cemetery of the forest, because the Soviet industry left a lot of waste there, branches, other parts of tree the industry didn't need, and they said that it was valuable. It was something important for the industry because the technological level of Soviet industry in the 1960s in particular, and later on, made it possible to manufacture also stuff from this waste. We also find some other points of criticism. You can see them here. So they also emphasized, how Gulag or the concentration camp in the Soviet Union was another factor which made wood industry quite type wood was exploited quite backward, because Gulag was the source of present labor who was used for wood harvesting activities. That was also something about clear cutting, and in general, many emphasize the technological gaps. So saying that, in fact, the Soviet type of forestry and cutting forest was actually very backward. So this brought me to the idea about forest alarmism, because I saw that some specialists emphasized the fact that the Soviets didn't understand that they're overexploiting their forests, they're killing their forests. And quite often specialists, very surprisingly to me, described the way the industry exploited own forestry shares with very human-like terms, because they said that forests were dying, they were not treated carefully, and so on and so forth. So forest alarmism implied that forests should be treated more carefully because of one particular thing, because the industry demanded more wood, it demanded more resources, and it would demand more resources in the future. So this is what some specialists emphasized particularly. So they said that Soviet industry must stop exploiting forests in the way it did before. So the forest alarmism literally stressed that the prospect of future scarcity of rich natural resources was over there, and they said that rich forest resources were something visible in the industry, and that was quite clear in the 1960s. So we see this narrative that was unfolding in this time, and they said that we had to do something with that. So forest alarmism produced a number of solutions, and in my research, in my book particularly, I discussed these solutions. So I found 3 of them, and if you get in my book, you see that my chapters are structures around these solutions. And I discuss how the Soviet regime, and specialists in particular, thought about forests in terms of geographical approach, in terms of modernization approach, and in terms of what I call like more sophisticated approach, or using some alternative resources to keep forests and wood safe, and using some other materials. So I would like to discuss very briefly 2 solutions. And the one was actually they both and all the solutions were part of what I call industrial embedded ecology. So this is actually part of the title in my book. I don't know why it doesn't work. So industrial embedded ecology, this is my term to say that this type of alarmism among people who were busy with forestry activities, were professionals working in this industry, it led to saving forests. because they wanted to produce more in the future. So actually, this story is about the way how hyper-industrialization and kind of gridness, this grid approach to nature, a desire to satisfy a growing demand from the industry and from the developing consumer society, and the way how they both could be satisfied with more careful exploitation of forests. So this is the main idea of the book. And again, it wasn't because these people, or people who work in the industry of the Soviet regime, were environmentalists. It's because they wanted forests to give most economic effect, to give more, as more as possible. And this is why they wanted to save forests, and that was part of their industrial discourse. So in my opinion, this discourse was developing from the 1950s and 60s. And gradually we see that forest was quite liminal thing. And this is what I call forest liminality. So when you see that it was a growing concern about forests as a complex resource, and that was increasing sustainability. And by the end of the Soviet regime, many said that forest was much complex that they used to think before, because it was not just something that provided resources only for humans, but it also part of biosphere. It was also something about nature as such. So what moved these solutions was rationality, and rationality was quite an important term in general, because in the late Soviet economy, the idea about the rational use of natural resources and forests in particular was very much visible. So they said that in order to provide this type of economic effect to the country, the industry must be rational. And it meant that rationality implied saving forests for the future generations, for the future use. Because again, especially in the 1950s and 60s, it seemed that the economic development was in full swing, and many thought that it would be so in the future, despite a gradual decline of the Soviet economy starting from the 1960s. But again, in the industry, many wanted to produce more and more from wood. So the first solution I'm discussing was imperial, and this is how the Soviet regime saw its eastern resources. So actually, the idea was to turn to the east in order to stop the overexploitation of this European part of the country, and they wanted to relocate their industry into the eastern part of Russia, particularly to Siberia and to the Far East. So the idea was to build what was called enterprises of the future, also called forest industrial complexes. So this were huge industrial enterprises, which usually included cities, and these were the projects. There's a number of such type of construction, which was actually introduced in the 1960s, and that continued until the end of the Soviet period. And one example of this big cities was Ustalin in Irkutsk, so in Siberia. And this industrial forest, industrial complex, forest industrial complex was seen as a new type of forest exploitation. So actually the idea was to establish no waste forestry in this region, and to construct really modernized huge industrial enterprises. And indeed, a number of enterprises was constructed, such as Ustalin. But I found also quite a lot of criticism of this construction, and many specialists were really dissatisfied with the way how Soviet regime introduced the industry into the eastern forests. Because they referred to rationality, and they said that forestry should be more mature, modernized. It shouldn't be wasteful. The forestry activities shouldn't leave for as much waste as it left before. And so they say that the industry must consume all the resources, all parts of the tree. They were quite not satisfied with the results, because they said that literally what was in the European part of the country was translated to the East, and all the practices that Soviet type of exploiting its eastern resources was about path dependence. So they said that their dreams about making really modernized, no-waste producers who consumed wood and made different types of modern paper packages and other products, it didn't realize as they wanted. There were a number of problems about that, and I call it grand disappointment in the East. So literally what the Soviet industry found in Siberia in the Far East was that it was very laborious to advance into these territories because they were quite poorly populated. They were densely forested, but it was very hard to build infrastructures there. So there were a lot of problems with transporting wood, with their actually satisfying the demands for wood in new industrial enterprises and so on. So that was very arduous technological advancement. And another problem was very sudden to those industrialists because they realized that the productivity of eastern wood, in particular fir trees, was less than in the European part of the country. And that was also part of disappointment about the story. So finally, we see that it was a story which just described Soviet, very typical Soviet and Russian path dependence, because the enterprises that were constructed in Siberia and in the Far East, like Ust-Lims, they were quite they were not so much modern as specialists wanted them to be, and they didn't make this industry the future as specialists believed. So another, just very briefly, another solution for the fear for alarmism around possible lack of forests because of this growing consumer demand was what I call turn to the south. And that was another set of projects, so which are just brought together, and they were scattered across the country. They were experiments in different industrial enterprises and research institutions related to forestry. And the idea was that wood be saved in terms actual forest could be cut less because there were other materials available and there were alternatives which could help keep forests safer in order to have it for the future. So they said about using some plants or perennial plants such as reed, and fascinating story which moved this use was connected to Nikita Khrushchev. And memoirs of one politician actually say that Khrushchev was flying over the Delta of Volga in the south of Russia. And Nikita Khrushchev was the Soviet leader from the mid-1950s and to 1960s. And he was well known for his enthusiasm about many things. And he was sitting in the airplane, and he was sitting together with Georgy Orlov, who was a big guy in the forestry industry, dating back to the Stalinist period, and he kept quite strong position in the industry. He had quite a strong voice, and he made many influential decisions. And they were sitting together in the plane, and this memoirist says that Orlov said to Khrushchev, Mr. Khrushchev, can you look through the illuminator, through the window, and do you see that there are big covers of reed beds growing in the Delta of Volga? Do you know that we can produce paper from reed, not from wood? And Khrushchev was a little bit hesitant, but he turned to be, very enthusiastic. And when they landed, so so this reed. Actually, he called to Kosygin. So Alexei Kosygin was the head of Gosplan and also quite a big guy in the structures of the Soviet economy. And he said that an enterprise should be constructed there immediately in order to produce wood, in order to produce packages, paper in the unforested Soviet South. And Kosygin was quite hesitant again because he said that first the plan was already there, so he couldn't change it. And second, he said that he never heard about these projects. But after a short fight, so Kosygin conceded, and finally the enterprise was constructed, and that was one of in the network of such type of enterprises. So that was constructed near Astrakhan in the south of Russia, on the shore from River Volga, and that was to produce paper and cardboard. And actually, that was completely based on reed at the beginning, so it didn't consume wood. But finally, it was clear that this enterprise was not working. So that was economically unprofitable. That couldn't exploit reed beds around carefully. So you actually see reeds also here, and literally they destroyed quite a lot of reed, and finally they had to supply this enterprise with wood from the northwest of Russia, so transporting it big distance, and that was quite a sad story. So that was a story of failure, and this is how it looks now, because right after the demise of the Soviet Union, this enterprise couldn't be competitive, and it was just closed down because it went bankrupt. And but literally, it was bankrupt at the very beginning. So the story of using reed and other alternative materials, other perennial plants, and also using paper waste, wood waste left in forest, and many said that it was also valuable material. So that was implemented in a network of enterprises in the south of the country. So you see the map here, and they could be more, but these projects were just a few, because they couldn't construct all these enterprises as they dreamt, because again, so they turned to be much complicated. And the main reasons why they couldn't, yes, so here you can see the titles of this, the names of these plans, also a number from in Ukraine, and also in the Kazakhstan Republic. But again, it didn't work properly, and I find that there were a number of reasons for this. First of it was a very wasting type of exploiting nature, because reed wasn't properly exploited, and there was also a technical problem because they couldn't come up with constructing a proper harvester, because they used quite heavy tractors and harvesting facilities, and literally they destroyed quite a lot of reed there. So even though they always said about rationality and the complex use of natural resources, and they said that reed could save wood, actually. Yeah, so this is a picture, and you can also find it in my book. So this shows how reed was growing every year. Yeah, and again, this shows the facilities they used, and again, so they couldn't actually they couldn't produce proper facilities which could harvest wood successfully. So and this piece shows an example of criticisms. Actually, it's one book which explains how reed was exploited in the Soviet Union and why it was exploited, but it says that one of the main problems was technical. So we see that finally, yeah, so it was a shortage of reed, despite the fact it was rich at the beginning. And by the end of the Soviet regime, it was a story, it actually failed, and that was literally forgotten in post-socialism. And I saw some examples of inventions in post-Soviet period, when some newspapers and other publications, professional brochures and some semi-popular publications, they told about innovators, inventors who invented actually some machines to make paper from reed. So it's again not repeating history, but literally it's about neglecting the Soviet experience. So finally, the enterprises that had been constructed in the south of the country, they consumed wood, which was again transported from the northwest of the country, and which actually kept the level of exploitation of wood quite high. We see that, yes, so it's probably a story about failure, and that was also very much connected to poor infrastructures and the lack of funding and experience, which was very visible in all these different projects, and also in the story about some constructing wood consumers in the eastern lands. So this was how industrial embedded ecology actually failed. But my point here is that it worked as a discourse, because the main idea in this stories about failures showed, and also more comes with my book, it was that it was different thinking about nature, because despite the experimental failure, despite finally the way how nature was exploited, how forests were approached was wasteful, the idea was to keep them safe. And that shows that people in the industries, specialists, people who usually seen as bad guys, yes, who killed nature, who wanted to clear cuts, who wanted to intensively exploit forests, they thought more about forests. They were still embedded industrially, so they still thought by the lens of industry, because they wanted to consume more, they wanted to produce more, and this is why they wanted to keep these forests safe. Sorry, but in general, these concerns and these complicated interactions between the industry and forests, they show a growing complexity, the notion about forests. So they show that forest was a liminal category in the Soviet Union. So, hyper-industrialization, again, was a trigger for more careful attitude towards nature as a resource, and forests in particular. So in the post-Soviet Russia, it was mainly neglected. And this is part of the story I'm discussing, because my point is that after the demise of state socialism, many said that everything socialist in the forest industry was backward. And I found a lot of ideas about, again, transferring Western experience to the post-Soviet Russia in order to modernize its forestry, and in order to introduce more efficient cutting of trees, and so-called Scandinavian type of tree cutting was introduced in northwest of Russia, and that was technology transferred from Finland and Sweden in particular. So I saw that in the post-Soviet forestry industry, the Soviet heritage was largely neglected. And even though the infrastructures built by the Soviets were there, but again, so I saw that there were some projects which came back, and they were very similar to what the Soviets invented. So they dealt with the ideas about using waste, about using alternative materials such as perennial plants, and other ideas that circulated among Soviet professionals in the late Soviet period. So this is about how history could be disrupted, but at the same time, how it could be repeated. Yeah, probably I'll just stop here, and thanks a lot for your attention, and thanks for your patience.
Elena, thank you for that presentation. A couple of observations I had, which was, it sounded, I was hearing in the early Soviet era, Stalinist era, I was hearing some parallels between Soviet forest history and American forest conservation history. The alarmism and the concern about exploitation, and then how can industry intervene and make a difference, get us away from these wasteful practices and stuff. So I found that those parallels interesting. And then leaping forward, and I apologize for skipping over about 50 years there. But after the Soviet era ends, the turn to the West and to Scandinavia for transferring technology. I was wondering if this is not a fair question for you at this to spring on you, but are you able to speak a little bit about the state of the forest industry in Russia today, or is that outside your area of expertise? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure some folks tuning in are curious as to where things stand now. How much embrace of Western technology and efficiency has happened over the last 20 to 40 years.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge topic, I would say. That's
Okay.
a big, subject for a separate research. But if to try to answer in a concise way, and again, to my capacity allows me to answer this question, because I'm a historian, so I connect the present situation to Soviet past. Yeah, so this is how I examine what's going on in Russia today, and in Russian forests today. Just I look at that through the lens of the relevance of Soviet experience in Russia today. But I would say that at the moment of at this moment, the picture is quite complicated, because it's not the planned economy anymore. And literally what came after the demise of this Soviet regime was private property, and many enterprises were sold to foreign companies. So, for example, one of the key producers in the northwest of Russia, so which is still there, still working, it's the Svetogorsk pulp and paper combined, so which is a huge enterprise on the border with Finland. So literally it's former Finnish enterprise, and that's still possessed by foreign owners. Yeah. So in this new reality, and this is just to stress that there's different processes happening there, right? Because these enterprises are different in terms of their own stories, how they transfer technologies, how they exploit their forests, and how they produce their products. So it's much diverse than it was in the Soviet Union. So that's the point. Yes, why I'm saying that. But in general, I would say that it's still about many bad things that were typical for the Soviet forest exploitation. It's to a large extent, it's still about clear cutting, and it's still about quite wasteful forestry, and it's still about a lot of corruption, so which was in particular in the late Soviet Union and in immediate post-Soviet period. And a couple of years, I think it was a few years ago, not a couple of years ago, it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I traveled to the Irkutsk region in Siberia, and I traveled near Baikal, and I talked to people who work in forestry, and also to people who work in states or institutions who are responsible for reforestation. And so they told a lot about problems which I found in my written sources from the Soviet time. Yeah, so it's about that. For example, people who rent pieces of the forest, so they clear cut them. They don't think about what would be next. Yeah, so they manage to avoid some responsibility for this type of exploiting forest and so on and so forth. At the same time, on the state level, there I saw some attempts to change it in a positive way, because in particular, just recently Russia forbade the imports of its cut forests abroad, and that was I believe it was part of political conflicts. Yeah, but it's also behind this, it was also something about making forestry more efficient, yeah, and decreasing the number of cutting. But unfortunately, the situation is that the Russian market is very small, and it couldn't, it actually can't consume as all this wood that foresters, people who work in business want to produce. And many of them, so they cut a lot and they sell it, they sold it. I'm not sure about the very moment, but until recently they sold it to, for example, China, to other countries were ready to consume Russian forests, and that was quite some it's an important part of the story. So I try to sum up that there's different processes in the Russian forestry and forestry industry today. It's quite diverse, because it's private, but in general, I saw that so the problems that foresters and people in forest control, described, they were still kind of repeating history, because I saw them previously. So I think it has changed in terms of structures, how the forest is governed, but practices of cutting are not too far away from what they were in the Soviet Union. It's my view. Yeah.
Okay. We've got some great questions coming in. So George Andre, first of all, it says, thank you for the fascinating presentation. In my research, and he's a doctoral student, his research is, he's studying Romanian foresters in the pre-World War II period. He sees many of the same concerns and rhetoric. And he says, funnily enough, even the illustrations. But concerns and rhetoric around infrastructure, waste, and balanced exploitation among experts. His question is, to what extent do you think these were mobilized to increase the influence of foresters and their institutions? And he clarifies, says, I do not mean that they do not genuinely believe what they are saying, but was one underlying motive to improve the positioning of state forestry as a profession?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do believe that the Soviet story was part of a bigger picture, and they did, the rhetoric and many processes were also shared by other state socialist countries. And in this sense, the Soviet economy and the Soviet forestry industry was not completely autonomous. It was connected to some more global and regional processes. I think that's in the Soviet Union, this things, and in general, this rhetoric was connected to the lobby from foresters, and obviously that was an attempt to increase the influence of foresters and in general the industry, forest industry. So that was what people in the forestry, specialists who were often also officials, they said it openly. So actually they tried to justify that forestry was still needed and was still important, and it was still competitive, and it was still source of many economic stuff, many economic products, consumer products. So I think that, yes, it was definitely part of the lobby, and indeed, I'm not sure, so I do agree that they probably didn't believe in what they were saying, because quite a lot in the discourse of what I call industrial embedded ecology just remained a discourse, and these ideas about rationality, they didn't work, even though they tried to, team of it, to consumer waste, to clean forests, and use wood waste in the industry. But in general, so that was a lot of rhetoric, so which is typical for state socialism. And they try, so they try to keep their position. So because they competed with other materials actually, and they tried to emphasize that wood was still important because it could supplement, substitute many other materials, and wood was applicable for making different stuff. So that was their point. That was also something relevant for the pre-Second World War period, because, for example, the guy I showed on one of my slides, Georgy Orlov, was very much influential in terms of lobby in the plant economy, and actually he, provided a lot of advices to the Soviet leadership and the ministry. Actually, a lot of reforms that happened to the ministry, to the main institution to govern the forest's activities. that happened because of his advice. And this lobby, that was quite strong. Yeah, to sum up, yes, my answer would be yes. It was an intention to to keep the position of the industry.
Okay, so we have two questions that are related, so I'm going to combine them. One, we have Lars and we have Brady inquiring about silviculture. And so Lars asks, why did the USSR not invest in reforestation and silviculture? Instead, they moved to a new logging frontier in the north and east. And Brady asks, what did Russia and other Soviet republics do in terms of regeneration and managing forests during the Soviet era? And how intensively did they carry that out? So yeah, that's one thing. That was a parallel to the American history of, well, we've cut out this area, we'll just move on to the next one. And so this is what you were talking about with the Soviets of we've exploited the Western forest, so we'll just move east. Okay, there's not much available there. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then there was this idea of turning south and actually turning to a whole new species, reeds instead of trees. So can you elaborate a little bit on the Soviet position on reforestation and silvicultural practices like that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I don't examine that specifically because it's just beyond the scope of my interest. Yeah, because my book discusses some more what I call necrophilos approach to forests. Yeah, because I'm interested in the way how forests are consumed but not reforested. Yeah, and this is why I looked at, and this is why I was surprised with the fact that people in this exploiting, in the exploitation sector wanted to keep forests safe. The problem with means why I discuss them separately and why I don't pay a lot of attention to silviculture was that these were two different stories in the Soviet Union. Just these were two different institutions, and the problem, I think it's was one of the main problems in the Soviet forestry in general, was that they were separated. Actually, people who worked in the forest industry, so they didn't deal a lot with people in silviculture. And they separated as two different institutions, and so they kept them separate. And so this is why I think this is the reason why I didn't find discussions about reforestation among people in the industry. Why they never addressed that. So they didn't communicate with those who were responsible for reforestation. But at the same time, it's a different world, I would say. So and there was quite a lot of reforestation activities, maybe not so successful, at the end of the day. And it's also very hard to assess it, maybe because how to measure, so to which extent it was, big or small percentage, how to measure it. I mean, it's very hard. But in general, yes, I mean, so it doesn't mean that they didn't do anything, and that was actually quite a lot of to explore forests. For example, they also developed forest aviation, and they managed to understand how much forest actually grows in the country by the 1950s. So because of this, and they also managed to control forest fires, insects and other factors of and destroying forests. But they also planted forests. So I can't say how much, because to me it's very hard to measure because I'm a historian. So I can't measure precisely, but but they did something. But again, my point is to show that there were also some intentions in the industry, and this is how they tried to solve these problems by very by the type of exploitation. So they thought differently. So they didn't think about planting such, but they thought about changing the way they consumed these forests. Yeah, and they existed, in parallel with planting. Um, yeah.
Okay. Scott Wallinger, so this has an observation, kind of mixed with a question, and it's based in the 1990s era. So, but he says Alexei Yaroshenko of Greenpeace Russia said that about 80% of forests in Russia were logged illegally. Again, this is in the 1990s. So clearly something changed if that's true. And so wondering if you're able to talk about
Mm,
logging, this divide between, I mean, if 80% of the forests are being logged illegally, is this something you can talk a little bit about?
mm,
So this is
yeah.
in the post-Soviet era,
Mm,
and how the basically forests were being exploited, but maybe we're defining exploitation a little differently now.
right. Uh, yeah, so there are quite different numbers, I would say, in evaluating how much forest was exploited, locked illegally. I do think, I'm not sure about 80%, but I can say that it was quite a big number of forests which were cut in legal way and which were sent to, for example, neighboring Finland. And also, it'll open my blog with the story, my personal, a little bit anthropological story about my childhood, because I was born in a very forested land of Russia, so, which is Karelia, and yeah, it's a neighbor of Finland, and I saw this logging trucks going to Finland, and everyone knew that they were legal for loggers. Yeah, so it was I mean, it was not proved, yeah, but everyone knew it. And there were also a lot of illegal activities from Finland in the 1990s. Yeah, I mean, it's maybe a little bit different now because the situation, I think that the situation has improved, but not completely. And again, when I traveled to Irkutsk a few years ago, so it was clear. So they didn't tell me explicitly about illegal cutting, but it was clear in in their interviews. I talked to people from the forest industry and forest protection organizations. So I think it's yes, so quite a lot of legal logging is still there. Yeah, so it's uh yeah, so I think it is quite high numbers. I don't have numbers with me, yeah, and maybe it would be punishable, if yeah, I can because the Russian state tries to hide this statistics, of course, yeah,
Sure.
and it's not so, yeah, and usually these numbers are provided by those who are kind of who are opponents to the Russian regime. And so, and usually, but sometimes I think that this number is also exaggerated. So I think that the true is somewhere in between. So maybe not 80%, but still quite high. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So not, in other words, not 5%, but
Not 5%. Yeah. Yeah, but maybe no one knows the truth, yeah, because it's also very hard. I mean, I don't like the statistics, so this is why I'm repeating that I can't measure, because I don't trust the statistics at all.
Mm.
And I saw quite a lot of examples of distortion of statistics in Soviet sources, and I know that it's also a matter for Russia today because we can't believe the statistics, yeah. So it's so this is why it's very hard, to say how many percent. But there was also quite a lot is said about China as quite a huge consumer of Russian wood today in a legal way. Yeah,
Mhm.
so that's also, and I also saw it in interviews, given by people from the industry. Yeah.
So Lars, who asked a question before, but I'm curious about this, and we'll finish with this. Lars asked how the forest sector planning was incorporated into the 5-year plans in the Soviet era. He has a couple other, well, and then he asks, with that, was a strategy to transfer, well, actually, we'll just stick with that question of how was the forest sector planning incorporated into the 5-year plans? Is that
Mm,
something?
yeah. So just I'm trying to get this question. I mean, you mean because it wasn't incorporated in the 5-year plan. I'm just trying to get
I'm
the
sorry, it
question.
was, the forest sector was part of the economic planning,
Yes, yeah. I mean, yeah, so they did have numbers. Yeah, so it yeah, so that was I mean, that was not chaotic. Yeah, I mean, that was part of the economy. Yeah, so which was yeah, and they had, you know, yeah, they had the plan every time. Yeah, so the point was that mm, because when we discussed this illegal type of forest activities, yeah, so that was also there. Yeah, so it doesn't deny this thing. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it was part of planning. Yeah, if this is the question, I'm just trying to
Sure. So he does
get,
ask, what
yeah.
was the strategy to transfer capital from the forest sector to other sectors of the national economy?
Mm. So actually, yes, I mean, if we try to speak about the value of the forest sector in the planned economy, so that was, I mean, that also was quite complicated because in words it was quite important, yeah, because they discussed it quite a lot, yeah. At the same time, and they also wanted to exploit it quite a lot, yeah. So they wanted to exploit it, um, you know, as much as possible, actually. And again, as my book shows, at some point they wanted to keep it safe in order to exploit it better in the future. So again, it was still part of the planned economy. It was still about thinking by the lens of planning and economic activities. And at the same time, you know, regardless of all these beliefs are in a better type of forestry and a better type of exploiting forests, the forestry industry remained quite a problematic industry in general, because it was, I mean, in general, it was not strategic. Part of it was strategic because part of it produced products, actually things relevant for the military sphere, like gunpowder, you know, some stuff used for military aviation, for rubber, you know, and that was important. But it was, yeah, and also supplied, you know, some, like, I don't know, cardboard boxes to the army, and that was important. Yeah, so they kept some enterprises at the strategic mode. Like, for example, one of the Storen Baikal they constructed in the 1960s. So that was designed for specifically for the strategic purposes. But in general, the problem with the forest industry was that it was super diverse. Yeah, and that included a lot of branches. Yeah, and this also was connected to many other industries. Yeah, and and that was compared to you know, other industries. It was poorly funded. Yeah, and that was to a large extent that was thought as a source of raw materials, and also because the Soviet regime, you know, got money, yeah, got currency for selling owned trees, for example, abroad. Yeah, so that was an important source for currency in this sense. Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, I'm trying to sum up
Yeah,
my
it's hard.
long answer. Yeah, so to answer briefly to the question, yeah, so that was part of the planned economy, of course, and yeah, that was a huge one, and that was seen as one of the sources for the benefit, you know. Yeah, and that was, I mean, on the state level, that was thought as a source of for raw materials.
Okay. Well, Elena, thank you so much.